Central areas sink south and fizzles out overnight, clearing skies then across much of England and Wales, and clear spells as well for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but it stays blustery in the north with further showers north of the central belt. Temperatures in the north 8 or 9 Celsius, further south 12 or 13 Celsius, particularly for those areas that are slow to clear the cloud. Parts of Cornwall could keep some cloud as we start off Friday. Otherwise, widespread sunny skies for England and Wales during Friday morning. Cloudier from, say, Cumbria northwards, and further showers north of the central belt once again with that keen breeze coming in from the northwest. That's going to make it feel cool, but where we've got the sunshine further south, a warm afternoon to come with temperatures reaching the high teens or low 20s. Plenty more fine weather to come this weekend as high pressure develops widely up and down the country. Sunny spells for most.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
On radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Today we're going to explore exactly what's going on with the Prime Minister and potentially support packages economically. Also, is he safe in his position as Prime Minister? We're also going to look at what the country thinks and what's going on with the NHS. Is it really being privatised? All that to come after your morning headlines.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Chancellor is set to announce a multi-billion-pound package to support ease the cost of living crisis. The measures are expected to include a discount on energy bills funded by a windfall tax on oil and gas companies. Labour, which has been calling for the move, says Rishi Sunak's finally being dragged kicking and screaming to a U-turn. Energy giants are warning the tax could do long-term damage to the oil and gas industry. Residents in Bristol told us they're struggling with the rising bills.
Currently it's okay, but I feel like we are going to be pushed to our limits. With a new baby in the household, the wife has decided to stay at home, so we've only got the one income at the minute. So, yeah, we're really looking at the way we use our facilities, our water, our electricity, our food shop and everything.
We're struggling to, I think my parents are thinking of downsizing house-wise when, I'm off to university next year and they're like, we can't afford to live where we live because I think our energy bills and stuff have gone up threefold.
The acting head of the Met Police could face further questions over the Partygate investigation. Sir Stephen House will appear before the London Assembly's Police and Crime Committee. London Mayor Sadiq Khan wants to know why the Prime Minister was fined for just one event, despite being pictured drinking at another. There have been fresh calls for Boris Johnson's resignation, but former Conservative MP Michael Brown told GBNews he thinks he'll survive.
Boris is still in danger, Eamon. He's first of all got to get through this Privileges Committee report. Did he deliberately lie? It's a very high threshold. I think he'll get away with that. What he's not going to get away with over the next 18 months, though, is if he doesn't nuke inflation.
The Texas gunman who killed 19 children and 2 teachers was reportedly inside the primary school for up to an hour. Armed with an assault rifle, the suspect, Salvador Ramos, locked himself in a grade 4 classroom and opened fire. The 18-year-old posted an online message just minutes earlier warning he was going to attack. President Joe Biden says he'll visit Uvalde in the coming days to speak to the victims' families. A British man with a debilitating condition has been given a new lease of life after a double hand transplant. 48-year-old Stephen Gallagher lost the use of his own hands because of an autoimmune disease called scleroderma, which causes scarring of the skin and internal organs. The father of 3 went ahead with the surgery despite being warned he could lose them altogether. He says his new hands are amazing. TV Online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, yesterday, the senior civil servant Sue Gray revealed her long-anticipated report over those lockdown gatherings in Whitehall and in Downing Street. Yesterday, I asked the Prime Minister about his rules and, potentially more importantly, the UK's falling real wages. Let's have a listen.
The fines that were issued across Downing Street and the whole of Whitehall were for events that took place over varying levels of restriction. It took months of investigation to determine whether a number of edge cases broke the rules that you set or not. Indeed, you said earlier in Parliament that it can be very difficult to decide the boundary between what qualifies as work and what qualifies as socialising. So in hindsight, were the rules that you set simply too unclear, too illogical and too tight for too long? And just, if I may, on another issue that really does affect people up and down the country, real wages are projected to be lower in 2026 than they were in 2008. What are you going to do about it?
So first of all, Tom, on the rules, we had to implement, and this is a controversial thing, and there are many people who think that you could have done without restrictions. You could have just relied on people's personal responsibility. The difficulty was that we were facing a pandemic of a kind that we'd never seen before, certainly not in my lifetime. Its effects were unknowable, and all the medical and scientific advice was that you had to proceed by non-pharmaceutical interventions. You had to get people to behave according to certain rules. So I don't think the flaw was with the rules, Tom. I've got to, we should have recognised that the boundary between work events and socialising for people who are continuously working together in the same place was going to be hard to draw, and things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently from now on. On your point about incomes, which is the crucial thing, and look, the COVID pandemic cost the government it cost taxpayers $408 billion just to support businesses and support families through the pandemic. It's left a very difficult fiscal position. Employment is very strong. Some features of our economy are extremely strong, but there's no doubt, because of the global supply chain shocks exacerbated by what Putin has done in Ukraine, by the spike in the price of energy, we're going to see pressures for a while to come. I've just got to be realistic with people about that. We're going to see pressures on household finances. So what I'm saying to people is that we will continue to respond, just as we responded throughout the pandemic. It won't be easy. We won't be able to fix everything. But what I will also say is that we will get through it, and we will get through it well. And that we have some fortunate fundamentals, not least, the lowest unemployment rate since 1974. That we have a strong labour market. We have a lot of firms who are looking to hire people, looking to grow, and that augurs well for the future. But there's no question we have pressure now on household finances. Everybody knows it, everybody can feel it, and believe me, the government is going to do everything we can to help people.
The Prime Minister there with quite an extensive answer. Well, Tory MPs mostly held back from challenging him yesterday, with only one new backbencher calling on him to quit. So, is the Prime Minister now safe? Well, joining me is Mike Wood, the Conservative MP for Dudley South. Thanks for being with us on the show today, Mike. We briefly bumped into one another outside the 1922 committee room yesterday evening. The mood in there seemed to be one of sorrow from the Prime Minister. Is the party ready to move on?
Well, I think most of the party recognise that a lot of what's described in Sue Gray's report shouldn't have happened. The Prime Minister was right to apologise for it, but we think Boris Johnson remains the best person to lead both the party and the country through, obviously, a time where there are some massive challenges that the Prime Minister was just referring to in your clip.
Now, it's clear that the Prime Minister was fined once. He was found to have broken the rules by the Metropolitan Police, but potentially more seriously, staff in Number 10, civil servants across Whitehall, were behaving really quite raucously. There's stories of vomit, there's stories of leaving at 4 a.m. None of these stories, of course, involved the Prime Minister himself. But to what extent is he responsible for the culture that was set in Downing Street?
Yeah, and I think the one new thing, or one set of things that we learned yesterday that we didn't know last week, and it actually does really answer the question people have been asking as to why at some of these events members of staff were issued with fines, but the Prime Minister, who had apparently been present at those events, wasn't issued with them. And we know it's because the Prime Minister went along to what was a workplace event to thank staff who were for leaving, spoke for 10 minutes and went, whereas what happened afterwards was clearly unacceptable and couldn't be described as a work event in any stretch of the imagination. I think the Prime Minister is obviously responsible for setting the culture. He's not responsible for managing the staffing structures in Number 10. Obviously, that's where you do need officials to be managing staff. But in terms of some of the cultural issues, Sue Gray identified in her interim report in February, and of course her report yesterday actually recognises the progress that's being made on, for example, separating work from socialising, on having a more modern and professional policy on alcohol at work that better reflects what most workplaces are like today, rather than what some of them were like, say, 30 years ago, where drinking in the workplace might be much more common, and the new processes so that people who do have concerns, are able to raise them, to be taken seriously, and actually know that they're going to be treated fairly. They're not going to be penalised for raising legitimate concerns. All of those are being addressed, and I think that's really important progress.
Yes, Mike Wood, I'm just looking here at the front page of the Daily Mail. A picture of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor standing at the Cabinet Room table, standing in their places at the Cabinet Room table, with the headline, "Is that it?" I mean, it does look like the worst party in the world, if indeed we can describe it as a party. It doesn't look like those are two gentlemen who are having particularly a lot of fun, and yet they were fined for it. Is there a grand distinction, in your view, Mike Wood, between that event, that rather dour, miserable affair with some cheap sandwiches at the Cabinet Room table, compared to what Sir Keir Starmer has been accused of doing in Durham, drinking with a rather more social environment of beer and curry?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I mean, the the photos of Keir Starmer in Durham do look more like a social event at the end of a working day rather than a work event. I mean, these photos, I think some people were expecting to see pictures of the Prime Minister dancing on tables and leading conga lines. And I think when people heard about Downing Street parties, this isn't quite what most people might have pictured. I mean, it's not exactly the last days of Rome. So, I mean, obviously the police decided that event on the Prime Minister's birthday wasn't breaching the rules. They've issued the fines. As far as I'm aware, those fines have been paid. Obviously, the Prime Minister's apologised. He's accepted that decision. Sue Gray's accepted the conclusions have reached, including obviously not issuing fines to the Prime Minister or to other members of the cabinet for any of the other events. And so I think the spotlight now probably will need to fall on what are Durham Police going to do about something that does look like it's very clear socialising, and actually both the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition repeatedly lying to try and cover it up.
Yes, clearly there does seem to be a distinction there that is very hard to draw between what Sir Keir Starmer is seen to be doing and what the Prime Minister did on that one particular event, at least. Just finally in this conversation, Mike Wood, I've got to ask you about what the Chancellor plans to say later today, the help that people so desperately need with their energy bills. What are you expecting?
Well, I mean, you probably know more about this than I do. You'll have had the embargo to press release. I'm still waiting for that. So I think what we're expecting is obviously this package that's probably going to be worth a few £100s off people's energy bills in the autumn, and it won't be repayable. So instead of the £200 repayable loans that were announced earlier in the year, I think we're looking at rather more than that, and it will be a direct payment to help people. As the Prime Minister was saying, everybody has been affected by rising prices, whether it's energy or food, but we know that there are a lot of people who really are struggling, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on what the Chancellor is saying later today and exactly how it's going to be paid for, of course. And there are some big questions to ask if big payments are actually going to be inflationary in and of themselves. But that, of course, is to be explored after the announcement. For now, Mike Wood, Conservative MP for Dudley South, thank you so much for joining me this morning on The Briefing. Appreciate your time. Well, that's the politics of it. Now, potentially, let's have a look at what the British public think. Aside from Westminster, is Boris Johnson and his government in tatters? Or is the situation recoverable in our brave new post-Sue Gray world? Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me now is Chris Curtis, Head of Political Polling at Opinium Research. Thanks for joining me, Chris. Always a pleasure to speak to you. First of all, while the Prime Minister seems to be a lot safer in the minds of his MPs, how has the British public opinion shifted, if it's shifted at all, over the past 2 weeks?
I don't think it's particularly shifted at all over the past 2 weeks. We obviously haven't had many polls out after Sue Gray's report yet. But if I'm honest, I'm not sure that the Sue Gray report is going to move things very much either. And the reason for that is that, while it's taken Sue Gray quite a long time to get her conclusions out there, the British voting public made their own conclusions about these events quite some time ago. They decided that the Prime Minister broke the rules. They decided that he wasn't telling the truth about it. And that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the Conservative Party has fallen behind in the opinion polls over the past few months, and why Boris Johnson's approval rating is nowhere near where it previously was. So it's done some damage to the Conservative Party brand. It's done some damage to the Prime Minister. The public do say that they're now ready to move on, but I think it's going to be very hard for the Prime Minister to come back from the damage that's been done.
Yes, we're looking on our screens now of Boris Johnson's approval rating, a poll that your organisation has done. And we can see that really Boris Johnson's approval is nowhere near as high as it used to be, even 6 or just about a year ago. It's been on a steady downward trend. However, there's been a slight tick up, nothing dramatic, but a slight increase. Is this Conservatives, perhaps, some of them, coming back to the fold?
Yeah, there is a little bit of that. I think, when stories like this first hit, there's a lot more of a dramatic move and eventually things start to float back. I mean, the big question going forward, I think, is, given that Partygate has done a fair amount of damage to the Prime Minister's reputation, how does he bring that back? Can he come back from this? If so, how? And the most likely path to him doing so is by being seen to handle the cost of living crisis well. There's currently a view among the public, not just that he was bad at partying, but that the Conservatives aren't particularly good at handling the economy either. That's actually the number that's probably more important for him to turn around. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to do so because God knows how tough the next few months are going to be with inflation and the economy. But I think that's ultimately what the government needs to be focusing all of its time on.
How much do you reckon that these two issues are actually interlinked? If the British public think that Boris Johnson didn't have control over his staff at Downing Street, potentially they may think he doesn't have control over the economy either. Is it a stretch to say that potentially one issue may fold into the other in public opinion?
I think to a certain extent it does fold into each other. I mean, we ask questions all the time like, do you think the Prime Minister's competent? Do you think he's a strong leader? Do you think he's trustworthy? And what Partygate's done is it's really damaged the Prime Minister's ratings on all of those numbers. Now, if people don't think he's competent, if people don't think he's a strong leader and people don't think he's likeable, they're just as likely to apply that to the way he's going to handle cost of living and economy as they are, to think that he broke the rules on Partygate. I think sort of the way I frame it in my head is this year was always going to be incredibly tough for the government, incredibly tough, with rising prices, a cost of living crisis. And that's always a difficult territory for the Conservatives to be playing on. The public tend to think that the Conservatives, who are the grown-ups who make the difficult decisions on the economy, but it's the Labour Party who are better at making the kind of decisions that help them in their own personal finances. That's the reputation the two parties have. So when you've got a situation like this where people's personal finances are really struggling, that's obviously going to be incredibly difficult for the Conservatives at the best of times. And the Conservative Party is not going into this crisis at the best of times, partly because of, or substantially because of, the Partygate allegations. And I think that is why us pollsters come on shows like this and tell you that we do think it's going to be incredibly tough for the Prime Minister and the Conservatives to get through this.
So, just in our final minute of this conversation, Chris Curtis, Boris Johnson said to his MPs last night that he hoped the Sue Gray report could draw a line under this. To some extent, it would help people understand the difference between the parties that he attended and those he didn't. He sort of seemed to get across the idea that he was quite upset with the idea that it was him, potentially, who might have been vomiting on the floor or who might have been staying till 4 a.m. and doing some of the raucous things that he was not doing. And to some extent, the photographs show that the Prime Minister was not having as much fun as potentially people would have thought. Do you think he's going to have been successful there? Or has the opinion not really shifted? Has Sue Gray not really changed that wider perception?
I don't think it will change that wider perception in either direction. I think people that thought the Prime Minister broke the rules and lied about it before, which is the majority of the population, are still going to think that. And I don't think that this report, these pictures, anything else is particularly going to change that. I think we are pretty much in the situation, to be honest, that we were in 2 weeks ago with a Prime Minister who was fairly unpopular and is going to need to do a lot of work to turn that around.
And in just a month, we've got those 2 by-elections. We'll be watching the polling for those pretty closely. But for now, Chris Curtis, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing this morning. Appreciate your time. Now, finally today, to our NHS. For over 40 years, we've been told by the media that the organisation is being, quote-unquote, privatised. But as far as I can see, it's still free at the point of use, and indeed more taxpayer cash is being pumped into it than ever before. Back in 1980, the Times newspaper predicted that over the next 5 years, the NHS would be privatised and drift towards an American-style paid-for healthcare system. This obviously didn't happen. And yet papers and politicians continue to make this prediction again and again and again. So what's the truth of it? And the truth of those constant claims before every election that we have just 24 hours to save our precious NHS? Well, Christian Niemitz is the head of political economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs and has written extensively about what he calls the NHS and 4 decades of privatisation paranoia, and hopefully can clear up some of the reporting that has been going on. Welcome to the programme, Christian. Glad to have you. Firstly, what do people mean by privatisation? We're constantly being told that the NHS is being privatised. Is it?
No, it isn't. And the fact that these stories have been around for over 40 years, that in itself shows you that this whole story, this whole idea is a whole load of nonsense, because you simply cannot carry on privatizing the same organization forever. No matter how slowly you do it, at some point, a privatization would have to be completed. It's something that you can draw out a little, that you can do slowly, but it has to come to an end eventually. And if it's supposedly been going on for over 40 years, and it still isn't an inch closer to being privatized, then that shows that the whole theory is nonsense. So there was never anything in that. But nonetheless, every time a new health reform comes along, every time a government makes some minor tweak to the healthcare system, somebody will repeat this prophecy saying, oh, careful, this is a Trojan horse, this will lead to privatization, whatever exactly they mean by that. And this will then be taken up by large sections of the media and the medical establishment, and it will become a full-blown moral panic.
It's interesting listening to the arguments as to why the NHS is being supposedly privatised. On the one hand, you have a group of conspiracy people who say that the NHS is being deliberately run down into the ground by the government, being made terrible, being underfunded, even though the funding's grown by astronomical tens of billions of pounds. They say it's being underfunded and therefore being ground down so it can be sold off. Now, the internal logic of that seems odd to me. If something's worth less, why would it want to be sold off?
Yes, that comes from a famous Noam Chomsky quote. He once said this is the standard technique of privatization, that governments underfund things and run them down in order to turn the public against them and then sell them off. But that's, of course, not how any privatization has ever worked. For the same reason that if you want to sell something that you own, say on eBay, of course, running down is the last thing you would do. You would do the exact opposite so that you can demand a higher price for it. So therefore, this idea is implausible in its own terms. But you can find people making that claim irrespective of what's actually happening on the healthcare funding side. This happens in years when real-term spending increases really are quite constrained. So early Cameron years, it was never cut, but it grew in real terms by less than 1% a year. But then we also had periods during the Blair years when the budget was growing by 6, 7, 8% in real terms every year. But you still had people saying, oh, they are deliberately underfunding it because they want to privatize it. So whatever you actually do on the funding side is irrelevant.
And the other argument that people use is somehow that private provision within the NHS is a route to privatisation. The idea that if the NHS uses an external cleaning company rather than an internal cleaning company, if the NHS presumably buys computers that haven't been created within the ecosystem of the NHS, that's technically private companies dealing with the NHS as well. Is there any truth to this NHS using I think it's about 10% these days of private contracting? Would the NHS be quote-unquote privatised if that crept up higher?
Well, you could say if the NHS bought all of its healthcare services, or the vast majority of services from private providers, that would still not be a privatization of the entire system. It would then still be free at the point of use and tax funded. But you would then have a public insurance system like in France or in Taiwan or in Canada, where you can have private provision and a government insurer would pay for most of that. There you could say that would be a different type of health system. But we're not moving towards that kind of system. We still have a system where the state is not just paying for most healthcare, but where most healthcare is also state provided in-house by the NHS itself. And the exact figure, of course, it goes up in some years, it goes down in some years. There is no systematic upward trend. It is, as you said, around 10% or just below, and has been for some time. But of course, what happens is in years when it goes up, you will have people saying, oh, look, more private contracts. This is clearly a plan, a long-term plan to privatize the NHS. Whereas in years when the figure goes down, nobody says a word about it.
Yes, I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme. I could talk about this for so long with you, Christian Niemetz. Really appreciate your time, and a new paper out, of course, from the Institute of Economic Affairs on that very issue. Well, thanks for watching today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy, but first, here's the weather.
Hello, a very good morning to you. I'm Aidan McGibbon. Mixed fortunes across the UK today. It will be breezy for all of us. There'll be rain in places, particularly central parts, but some brighter spells either side of that damp weather. The damp weather coming in from the Atlantic, a weather front stretching across Northern Ireland and then into southern Scotland, northern England and North Wales. That's where the dull and damp weather is first thing, but actually it's moving through, it's easing. So after a damp start for Northern Ireland, brighter skies with some showers follow. And for central and northern Scotland, a blustery day to come. Gales are on exposed northern and northwestern coasts, and